So good evening. We are today here for the third lecture of the November talks. And this evening we decide to host young women and very good architects from UK. Manijeh Verghese, I would say in Italian, Verghese, because it's so similar to Italian, no? And Madeleine Kessler are the curators of the British Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale 2021, but they are also partners and founders of the Unscene Architecture. The title of their lecture is also the title of the pavilion, and is The Garden of Privatized Delights, which is, I think, their way to show how they were inspired by the topic, or let's say the question of the Biennale curator, how will we live together? Analyzing the actual urban condition of public spaces in UK. I think today we will assist to a sort of opposition between some issues. Utopia versus dystopia, simulation versus reality, architecture and best practice. Those are some of the issues they worked on to give to the visitors an immersive experience. But today they are not only invited to show their works and the philosophy of their office, but such as was for the previous architects invited during these November talks, we also asked you to connect or to discuss your position with that of the President of the European Commission, who stated that nowadays or for the future, form will follow planet. And we ask you this to stimulate a new debate between architects, artists, designers, such as we are here, on the future of our lifestyle on the earth. And I think that at the end, this is also something that you try to show in your pavilion. So I'm very honored to have you today here in this Manfredo Tafuri aula, and I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry, we'll just change over. Thank you so much for having us here today. We're really excited to be giving a lecture in person and in Venice in your beautiful university and hall. The title of our talk is The Garden of Privatized Delights. We do encourage you as well at the end of the presentation to please ask questions and have a discussion.
So the title of the pavilion and our project came actually from this painting by the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch, The Garden of Earthly Delights. And we were really inspired by the triptych format of this painting and how the middle ground of Earth, which is the subject of the painting, is framed on either side. On the left-hand side by the kind of utopia of the Garden of Eden or heaven, and then on the right-hand side, the dystopia of hell. And in the middle, there's this kind of rich territory that needs to be explored between these two extremes. So when we actually entered the competition to kind of curate the British Pavilion, and because a lot of you are students in the audience, we always like to tell people that you should always enter the competition. Neither of us ever expected we would win this competition, and it's been a real journey since. But when we were entering the competition, we started by uninhabiting the painting, which revealed this kind of rich green landscape, but it also showed us how devoid of life and interest it becomes when you take away all of the incredible structures and the forms of inhabitation that were in Bosch's original. And then we re-inhabited the painting with, to create our version, the Garden of Privatized Delights. And here you see these two extremes of the triptych translated into, on the left, the utopia of common land before the Enclosures Acts in the UK in the 18th century, where a lot of common land suddenly became privately owned for the first time. And then on the right, you see the dystopia that we potentially could be heading towards of total privatization. And in the middle, we wanted to frame privatized public space, which is something that occurs in cities all over the world, but specifically in the UK, it's something that's been on the rise for several decades now, and we wanted to explore this as a rich territory for architects to really work with the public to open up how these spaces can be used and inhabited. And to bring things back to Venice, we thought it was also really interesting that a lot of public space in the UK was actually modeled on the Italian Piazza as a really truly public space that's cross-programmed and has a whole host of diverse activities. But somehow in the translation to the UK, a bit of this true publicness has been lost in terms of what activities people are allowed to do in these spaces and who actually has access to them. And some of these barriers are physical and some are invisible, but we really love this, this image because it talks about the original ambitions for British public spaces and maybe how we can somehow return to those.
I think we really love how this image and piazzas in general, they're kind of like the stage that you can watch all this activity occurring. And I think that's something that we've been really inspired by and wanted to bring forward in our work as to how we can open up different types of public space around the UK. So sort of to bring it back to the UK and the sort of really pressing issue of privatised public space. So privatised public space is any piece of land which is privately owned but can be publicly accessible. And it's a huge issue when you're in the UK because actually you don't really know who owns the land that you're walking on often. And this is a study by Guy Shrubsole and Anna Powell-Smith called Who Owns England? And there's a website which has that name called Who Owns England, which we'd really encourage you to go to. It's got this interactive map, which you can see here, and everything that's coloured in orange is privately owned. And there's a real issue with transparency of land ownership in the UK. So it's only over the past few decades that it's been compulsory to register who owns the land that you're buying. So there's whole swathes of the country that no one knows who owns, because unless that piece of land has been sold recently, there's no registry, there's nothing to actually track who owns that piece of land. And so everything that is grey on this map is undocumented. And then even when it is sort of documented, often it's owned by an overseas company, which is the image on the right. And that overseas company may not actually be within the UK. So there's real lack of transparency of who owns the land that you're using or you're walking on. And that becomes a real problem if, for example, you see a piece of land near you and you're like, that could make a really great kind of community project or playground, and no one's using this piece of land. But unless you know who to actually go to, you can't take that step forward to sort of repurpose it and use it. And so we're really interested by this topic, and over the past few years we've done quite a lot of research into it, and there is a lot being written about it. So this is another book we'd recommend called The New Enclosure by Brett Christophers, which looks at the fire sale of public land over the past few decades. Sort of since Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, a lot of public land started to be sold to the private sector in a sort of very short-sighted way of thinking to get money into the public sector very quickly, but then they would lose all these assets which become privately owned, and there's no sort of control over retaining a sort of public use or public access to that land. And so this is sort of an example in London. It's called Paternoster Square, and it's right next to St. Paul's Cathedral in the centre of London. And in 2011, there were these Occupy protests. And so there were all these protesters using this square at the centre of the image, protesting there. And it actually turned out this piece of land was privately owned. You wouldn't know it when you're walking there because it feels very public, but it was privately owned. And one of the rules on that piece of land by the private landowner, the Mitsubishi Estate Company, was that you're not allowed to protest there. And so that meant all the protesters were moved off this piece of land and they had to protest on the pavements. And that becomes really scary when suddenly you're not allowed to protest. Suddenly you don't have these kind of basic human rights on a piece of public land. And I think for us, like, this really kind of provoked an interest into, firstly, how can we, how do we make it clear, like, what you can and can't do on private land, and how should there be like a common set of standards? Yeah, for example, the GLA, the Greater London Authority, they last year, or earlier this year, they finalised the Public London Charter, which is this series of sort of rules that every single piece of privately owned public space must abide by. And this is the first of its kind, and it's very new, because often you don't know whether you're on a piece of private land, you also don't know what the rules are until you've broken them. So how do we make sure there's a common set of standards and rules on these spaces? So for example, how do we make sure that these spaces are free of charge to use? How do we make sure that everyone can feel welcome? How do we make sure that they're publicly accessible to everyone? And so we're really interested in the role of the architect and how we can act at every sort of scale in the city, from legislation right the way down to sort of a detailed design. And that's what we've sort of taken forward in our project for the British Pavilion.
And I guess what's been really exciting about getting this commission to curate the British Pavilion is that we got to be part of lots of really interesting conversations. So the Mayor of London that produced the Public London Charter, we got to be involved in some of the conversations that shaped that, which we probably wouldn't have been able to do had we not been working on this project. So it's been a really exciting opportunity. And then in return, they contributed to our exhibition catalogue to talk about how do you actually make a charter that unifies privatized public space and public space. But to go back to where this idea came from, Maddie and I have kind of collaborated together for many years, but back in 2015, we taught a summer school at the Architectural Association called Public House City that was really looking at the British pub as a positive example of privatized public space. And too often people see I guess this issue as too much of a binary, so the private is always seen as bad and the public is seen as good. And as Maddie said in that example about the fire sale of public land without public knowledge, if all this public land is being sold without our knowledge, is it really public? And so we were really interested in how typologies like the pub, which you never think of as a privatized public space, are actually really interesting and we can learn from them. And we were looking back at the history of the pub and how it really began as people opening up their living rooms to allow people to come in and share a drink and also have a conversation. And they really were an important political space where most of the important decisions were made before or after a session of Parliament. But also they were just much more than just a space for drinking, which is maybe what they've become now, and instead have become these important social spaces where people from all different walks of life and backgrounds can come together and have a conversation. And I guess before COVID, we had a really interesting workshop with students from the ETH in Zurich who came over to explore the impacts of Brexit on the UK. And we thought we'd take them to Wetherspoons, which is a chain of British pubs, to explore that because Wetherspoons was very involved in the whole Brexit debate with the owner of Wetherspoons encouraging people through things that you find in the pub to vote for Brexit. And so we expected to have a really negative experience there, but like with all privatized public space, it wasn't really a binary experience. And instead, we were able to sit in the space, use their Wi-Fi. I think about 20 of us were in there for about 3 hours. And during that time, we saw people from all over come in, and different groups of people were coming in at different times of the day. And we could stay there all for the price of like ATP that got you unlimited refills of cups of tea, which is why we thought we'd include this picture. And the pub is a really interesting territory as well, because there's been lots of, I guess, even before COVID, it was a typology that was definitely under threat as more and more pubs are closed to make way for high-end residential developments. And so there's been lots of community groups that have come together to list their local pub as an asset of community value and try and own the pub collectively, which is a challenge. And I think a lot of groups aren't even aware that you can do this. And so a big part of what we were trying to do with the pavilion is unify research and work and community initiatives that are already happening so that people and the average citizen becomes aware of what power and agency they have over their public spaces. And this is another example. This is the Joiners Arms in Hackney, which is around the corner from where Maddie lives. And it was a really important LGBTQ space and was really used by that community, not necessarily as that they started the pub, but they kind of appropriated the pub as their space. And then sadly it was demolished. But what was really interesting is that they managed to protect the use of the space. So whatever comes in its place will have to provide a space for this group and this community to continue using. And it starts to talk about like how the pub can be so much more than the space for drinking, can actually include these community groups that have traditionally been marginalized in society.
So, sort of that's the background to our research and sort of everything we've been looking into over the past few years. So how does that translate into the Garden of Privatized Delights? So as you enter the pavilion, I don't know how many of you have been to the Giardini and the British Pavilion, but as you enter, we sort of wanted to set up this triptych so you're really entering into that middle ground. As Manijeh was saying, we're really interested in how this is often a very binary conversation, but in fact, we're all living in this middle ground of private-public. And so how do we as architects and the general public, how do we navigate this middle ground to open up our public spaces to make them accessible and welcoming to everyone? And you're sort of taken on this journey through the typical British town and city, through different types of privatised public space across the UK. And each room has been designed by a different room designer who's taken on this brief of a type of privatised public space and reimagined that type of privatised public space to be more accessible and inclusive. And so the overarching question of the pavilion is, can we rethink what privatised public space could be? And each room does ask a different question about privatised public space, but this is the overarching one. So as you enter, you're sort of confronted by the railings. And so these are sort of taken from garden squares across the UK, which are sort of really familiar in Georgian towns and cities. And ironically, the garden square was sort of modelled on the Italian Piazza, but obviously it's completely different because it's gated and enclosed, so it's really exclusive. It doesn't quite function in the same way, and often these are very dead spaces across the UK. And that for us is really setting up the issue of privatised public space, that often it's only accessible if you have a key. And we were really interested in how, for example, in World War II, a lot of the railings were taken down from around garden squares and melted to be used for ammunition. And what happened was a lot of these garden squares opened up and they became accessible for everyone to use. And Catalina Pollock-Williamson did this incredible kind of installation looking at the history of this, which also includes these excerpts by George Orwell, talking about how incredible it was to suddenly meet people from all walks of life in what had previously been very exclusive garden squares. And we think the image on the bottom left, that's Bedford Square, just outside of the AA where we both studied. And I think that kind of, you see on the left where it's got the railings, and then someone's done like a very early kind of photo, like montage before Photoshop, showing like how different it is without the railings. And I think that was really formative as well for us, that we were studying at the AA where, you know, we have Bedford Square, which we couldn't access unless you went on some convoluted route to get a key. So everyone was eating their lunch sort of on the pavement, and you've got this garden square inside that no one could use. So you're sort of immediately ushered on into the next room, and you have to continue through the entire pavilion until you find yourself back inside the garden square. And the next room is the pub. It's called Publicani, and it's been designed by the decorators. And it's really sort of looking at how the pub, you know, it's this sort of really important communal centre for towns and cities across the UK, yet it's closing down. So how do we rethink it for the 21st century? And how do we make it as a place that's more than just a drinking hole? You know, how can it become this versatile centre for civic action? And in fact, in places across the UK, particularly rural places and rural villages, where you see a high rate of pub closures, you often see an increase in alcoholism. And so the kind of relationship between the pub and drinking, you know, it's much more than just a place for people to get a drink. It's also a place for communities to meet. And over the past year, sort of we had this situation where for the first time in British history, every single pub was forced to close in the lockdown. And as we came out of the lockdown, the way that the government would communicate what we could do was by what you could do in a pub, whether you could drink a pint or you had to eat a meal. And it really sort of showed how important pubs are to British culture, yet there's nothing really happening to sort of reinvent and redefine them in the 21st century. And so the room sort of has this central installation, which is the pub bar, and it sort of drops down to different heights to allow everyone to come around the table, no matter what their age, no matter their ability. And then there are bits of infrastructure which are embedded within that, such as a letterbox or sort of plug sockets to allow people to use this bar structure in many, many different ways. And then on the wall to the left, you can see these carpets, and they're from Wetherspoons pubs. So Manijeh mentioned the Wetherspoons earlier. Wetherspoons is the UK's largest pub chain. It owns thousands of pubs, and every single one has a different carpet. And there's something about that where they want to feel like they're locally specific, even though they're part of this huge pub chain. And then there's a karaoke which plays in the background, and that sort of portrays how important the pub is in British culture through sort of soap operas, the news, and how it's sort of real rich history informing pub culture. I think as well with the pub, something we're really interested in is that often people think privatized public space is a new thing. They think it's just these sort of paved squares and new developments. And the pub for us, it really shows how it goes back for centuries within British culture. Sort of the pub was the opening up of people's living rooms, to the public. So it's something that's really embedded in British culture, and has been there a really long time. So how do we sort of work with it to make it more accessible and work for everyone?
And like what was said in the introduction, I think a big part of what we were trying to do was create these immersive spaces and spaces that invited you to interact with them. So the karaoke is also there to make you sing the song, but also through singing it, think about, how important these spaces are and how urgent it is to preserve it. And so from there, you move into the Ministry of Collective Data. So while there's 4 kind of existing privatized public spaces that you would find in the UK town and city across the 6 rooms of the pavilion, there's also 2 proposed government ministries, and this is the first one. And we were really interested here in looking at this idea of data as an intangible thing that gets collected from us every day, maybe without our knowledge in some cases. And then in some cases, you see things like CCTV cameras throughout the city. And I think in the space of an hour, your image gets collected by over 300 CCTV cameras if you're walking through a stretch of central London. And so there's so much data that's being captured, not just by these pieces of urban infrastructure, but also by our phones. And what happens to that data? Who owns it? And how is it actually being used? And all of these questions are really opaque. And so this ministry is really trying to advocate for a more bottom-up approach. And it's asking really specifically about facial recognition technology and how this can actually become something that could be collectively owned and used for public benefit. And so again, we go back to this idea of the binary issue. So while facial recognition technology has been problematized a lot in the news, and we think it's bad, it's not necessarily born bad. In fact, there was a case study in India how it was used to locate thousands of lost children, and there's applications that can actually be really beneficial. But too often, it's maybe the power structures that control it don't allow us to access that information. And so how can we be more transparent? So when you come into the room, you are encouraged to either walk left if you don't consent to have your image captured, or walk right to have your image captured. And then it gets translated into an avatar that kind of follows you around the room and you can interact with. And then in the totem in the center of the room, there's some information about facial recognition technology and how it's used. But it also suggests that if this was collectively owned, how could it then be used to make decisions around, what sort of programs would you like to have in public space, or what kinds of public artwork could be there, and how this kind of data could actually be incredibly useful to shape our cities and spaces at a kind of larger collective scale. And there's also these large tree trunks in the space, and they're there as a form of camouflage. So if you didn't want your image to be captured, you could actually hide behind those to resist being documented. And the whole idea is that you can actually interact with the space and make you question actually who owns your data, and how you could notice that more as you move through a typical city.
Yeah, I suppose we're really interested in sort of the power of the collective and how we as citizens can come together to take better ownership over things like our data and start to have a say in that, rather than just accepting the status quo. So, with the classic example that someone on our team said, is when you're waiting for a bus, you want to know how long it is until the bus comes. But if that bus driver knows that you're waiting there, that's really weird. So it's how do we sort of flip this to be more in control of our data? So from the Ministry of Collective Data, you go into the High Street of Exchanges. And this has been designed by Studio Polpo, who are based in Sheffield in the north of England. And they're doing a lot of sort of community projects on the high street, including this food hall project, which is a pay-as-you-feel project. So it sort of inhabits an empty shop front on the high street, and they take sort of unused groceries and food from local supermarkets that would otherwise be thrown away, and then they cook with that food, and they allow anyone to come and eat a meal, and you just pay whatever you can afford or whatever you feel. So it really brings lots of different people around the table. And then the space, it sort of transforms at different times of the day into things like yoga classes, dance classes, and some DJ sets in the evening. And this kind of line between participant and volunteer is really blurred. And so it's really looking to challenge the economics of the high streets, and how the high streets is more than just a commercial centre, but it's also this really important social centre. And so the room is asking, could the high street go beyond commercial interest, become a place of diverse social exchange? And so as you enter the high street, you're sort of confronted by this ATM. And instead of dispensing money, the ATM dispenses pieces of advice. And then the room is sort of like this extruded shop front, which sort of addresses three things. So listen, share, and act. And you'll notice this kind of signage actually dotted around the different rooms of the pavilion. We really wanted to flip the traditional signage within privatized public space, which tells you what you can't do, and encourage people, to do activities. This is what you can do. And so the listen section, that's looking at when, for example, you go and get your haircut, you're not just getting a haircut, but you're also getting a conversation with someone. And that can be really important. For example, someone who's elderly and lives alone, that might be the only conversation they have all day. And so how do we sort of retain these uses as our high streets are sort of dying out? It's become incredibly important and even more pressing over the past year. I'm sure you have the same issue in Italy of the high streets just completely dying and shops not being able to survive. And when you sit down in the barber's chair, you can hear this soundscape from Sheffield High Street. And then the central section share, that's sort of looking at the food hall example of getting everyone around one table. And I think that's a lot of what our project in general is trying to do, bring lots of different people around the table. Often, people like developers, politicians, local communities, architects. We have very aligned kind of goals and visions, but we're all coming at them very segregated and in silos. So how do we bring everyone together? And that's sort of what this middle section is really looking at. And then finally act, and that's looking at the different roles that you can take on in the community. And there's this receipt dispenser, which is dispensing those pieces of advice from the ATM. And throughout these cones, you hear these soundscapes from the high streets, and then there are these banners with the sort of printed images from Sheffield high streets.
Yeah, so from there you move into the second ministry, the Ministry of Common Land. And so while the last ministry was looking at how our data can be collectively owned, this is really looking at issues of land and what does it mean to really have common land. And so I think 2 years ago, only 4% of all land in the UK was commonly owned. And this room is designed by Public Works, and a lot of their projects are really working with communities and trying to help them understand what agency they have, and looking at gap sites across the city that can be kind of taken over and used in different ways. So they've been looking into a lot of policy that governs how land is used and disposed of, and questioning that. Again, looking at ownership. But then in the bottom image where you see people holding up signs, they've been really working on how do we document the conversations that are happening with communities. And we thought this was really fascinating. So they call this a situated image, and there's an example of a really amazing big one in the pavilion. But in this case, they were looking at how when you meet with a community, often you're discussing really important ideas, but if you took a picture of it, it's really just people sitting around drinking cups of tea. And so how do you actually document that in a way that has an impact? So they work with the communities to make these props and signage, and they bring people together in different poses as a way to kind of manifest the conversation that's been happening and communicate it to a wider audience. So this room is really asking about this bottom-up approach to decision-making when it comes to public land or common land, and so how to use something like a citizens' assembly to develop strategies for how land ownership and use can be discussed. And when you come into the room, there's this big mound in the center, and it's worth saying that all of the designs, I guess, or forms that you find in the pavilion are inspired by forms from the Bosch painting. But this mound is designed as a citizens' assembly, and as you walk around it, there's different details that start to talk about community participation in different ways. And rather than entering into a room and having this hierarchical minister's desk with the minister behind it, here instead there's like a kind of central table, and as Maddie was saying, it's really designed to bring different decision makers around one table to have a conversation. And there's books, there's resources you can read. These papier-mâché heads that you see on the top were all made by school children in Stratford, and they are like kind of representations of the forefathers and mothers of the discussion around common land. So Jane Jacobs, Colin Ward, and several others. And there's 8 of them in total. 4 of them are in Venice and 4 are still in the UK. And you can see them in the image behind over there, which is the kind of big, large-scale situated image that was created for this project. And this is an excerpt from the image, and it's at a site in Loughborough Junction in South London that Public Works has been engaging with the community there for over 10 years to design like an adventure playground, a community kitchen, a community garden, and a center. And over a course of one day, we got to be part of it as well, which was really an exciting moment just as we were coming out of lockdown. But they invited these different groups to like enact different discussions that they'd been having over the 10 years to create this really incredible image. And so we encourage all of you to go and check it out if you haven't seen it already, because there's so much detail in there in terms of a wider discussion about what common land really is. And then, yeah, this is the central table, and there's also things like on the back reverse side of this bookshelf, there's a ladder of participation, which is really meant to talk about the different steps we need to take to reach a truly community participatory process.
Then you move into Play Without Grounds. And this has been designed by VPPR architects. And it's really looking at how there's just nowhere in our cities for young people and teenagers anymore. It's sort of often you just find that the only places they're welcome in are sort of shopping centres. And as soon as you see any group of young people or teenagers, they're sort of ushered on. And as we've seen a really high rate of closure of youth centres over the past 10 years, particularly in London. And so this room's looking at, can we design new spaces in the city for teenagers to occupy on their own terms? And so it takes a spherical form from the painting. And as Manijeh said, like a lot of the structures are inspired by forms and the colours of the painting, including the gradient walls behind. And I suppose it's taken this abstracted form and provided a space for teenagers to inhabit, a framework for them to use however they'd like. So often in cities, you find spaces that are designed for very active teenagers, like skateboard parks or basketball courts. But in fact, a lot of teenagers, I know myself included when I was young, all I wanted to do was sit around with my friends. And as soon as you do that, you're seen as a threat. And particularly female teenagers tend to just want to sit around and hang out. So how do you provide spaces which they can inhabit on their own terms like this? And so this structure at the top, it allows for people just to lie down. The rungs are sort of space to allow people just to sit. And then in the center, there's a stage that young people can sort of inhabit and dance or, perform in. And around the structure, there are these speakers which play conversations with teenagers and young people from across the UK. And those conversations, they're really interesting because they take different teenagers from all walks of life, and all of them are talking about how, for example, the only space they really feel is theirs is their bedroom. And as soon as they're sort of in a park or with friends, they suddenly don't feel very welcome. And it's a huge issue. Like, if teenagers don't feel welcome in a city, that then sets up a whole load of other social problems. So this is a really important room for us, and it's a group that we think are often completely forgotten about. And again, there's a signage which are encouraging people to do things. So please loiter. Everyone is welcome. Play music.
It's probably worth maybe saying that, as Maddie was saying before, we worked with our graphic designers, and they really brought the elements of the painting to life, like the gradient on the walls that's actually sampled from pigments in the painting. But also they developed these amazing typefaces that are drawn from privatized public spaces. So this one in particular actually uses finger-painted letters as a way to tell people that they should make their own signs and actually encourage new forms of activity, which is really what we were trying to do in the pavilion as a whole in terms of asking these questions rather than telling people how they should occupy privatized public space.
Also the color scheme, so this kind of goldy, we called it toxic yellow, it's toxic green, sorry, it's the color scheme you see on all the kind of marketing material as well. This was a pigment that the graphic designer identified as like the antithesis of the gradients in the painting, and so it's the complete opposite, and the idea is that it sort of overlays as this complete opposite kind of pigment.
So then finally, having been through all the other spaces in the pavilion, you find yourself back in the main room, which is the Garden of Delights. And here we were really interested in, having been through this whole journey, how does the whole experience come together? And these are examples from Bedford Square, which Maddie talked about earlier. It's like a square that's right outside the Architectural Association where we studied and where we taught that summer school that started this whole project. But there's really interesting moments like this one on the left where a tree has like really merged with the railings, and like nature and kind of human-made things are like becoming one. And how we can really open up these spaces to allow them to be used not just by humans, but by non-humans as well, and encourage all forms of life to kind of enjoy them in different ways. And so the question that's being asked here is really, how do we open up and reprogram these exclusive garden squares to make them much more inclusive and create, I guess, richer public outdoor spaces that can be used by people for a lot longer? And so the structure in the center is again inspired by forms in the painting, but it's designed as a kind of abstracted tree. So it has 5 different sections loosely that it's divided between, and it encourages you to play by climbing through these openings or peeping through these apertures, to sit down and have a conversation, to grow produce on the trellis that comes out of it, to cook. There's a solar kitchen on another side of it. Or just really to sit and have a moment by yourself and contemplate, because there's not enough spaces in the city where you can sit and just be alone with your thoughts. And audio obviously has a big role to play throughout all the rooms in the pavilion, but in this room in particular, we wanted to talk about multi-generational spaces. And so we have children talking about their favorite green spaces. We have a 90-year-old woman talking about her memories of the Second World War and when those railings were removed, what opportunities were afforded by public space. And we have a landscape designer that actually worked with us on the project, talking about the importance of greenery in our cities and the different types of species and different types of conversations that actually green spaces enable. And so it's really a moment where you can reflect on not just this room, but the whole experience, and really think about what your agency is as an individual or as a collective in transforming your local public spaces.
So this is the room where everything sort of comes together from that journey from when you first entered the pavilion. And I think just while we're on this slide as well, something hopefully you might have picked up on is every room in the pavilion sort of has this central installation, and that was something we gave as a brief to each of the designers. We really wanted one central object which we can then bring back to the UK and put in different types of public spaces around the UK, which we'll come on to later.
And again, the signs in here are encouraging you to cook together, to stay a while. We were really inspired by like this David Green from Archigram's project for the rock plug and the log plug, and looking at how do we hybridize nature with infrastructure to allow us to stay in these spaces for longer. So we have tree trunks that have plug sockets in them so people can like charge their phone, or we really tried to think about like what are the ways in which, you know, through lighting and things like that, we can make public space feel safer and more open to everyone.
So you've been through the entire pavilion, and now it's time to talk about our surprise 7th room, which is in the basement of the British Pavilion, the toilets. So not many people know that the British Pavilion is one of the few pavilions that actually has toilets in the basement. And we were really surprised when we went over just after we'd won the competition and they were installing the Art Biennale. And the British Pavilion was this real social hub because everyone was coming from all the different pavilions to use the toilets in the basements. And that for us was really interesting because we met in the queue for the public toilets at the AA. And we think, you know, toilets actually, they're really important because they allow the kind of infrastructure to access all these public spaces. It's all well and good having a really nice park or something, but unless you've got the toilets or drinking fountains or free seating, people can't actually use that space. And so we wanted to open up the toilets for people to use. And we were really interested as well how in the toilets, these are kind of some drawings that were done by the invigilators at the time, the fellows, of cats in the pavilion, of the pavilion cat, which wanders around the Giardini.
But it shows like how people take over like these public toilets in different ways and start to like add their own notes and signs to them.
So this room is asking, can we fill the void left by the disappearance of the public toilet in unique and surprising ways? So there's been a real lack of public funding for public toilets in the UK. Like, it's not written into any kind of legislation that any local authority has to provide public toilets or a certain number of them. So when their budgets are cut, they often cut the public toilets. And where they are provided, they're often completely inadequate. So I don't know if you've been to London recently, but you often get these kind of oval-shaped public toilets, which look really defensive. And if you go inside one of those, you can only stay in there for a maximum of 15 minutes, or otherwise an alarm goes off, you get sprayed with water. Or if you go in with like a buggy or you're in a wheelchair, you'll set off the weight limit, and again, you'll get sprayed with water. And so we're really interested in how can sort of private and public work together to provide public toilets, because also the issue is it's often been left to the private sector, but then unless you can afford to buy a cup of coffee or, you know, to buy something from a shop, then you can't actually use the facilities. So, you know, we're really excluding the most vulnerable in society. And this actually is a huge issue, and it became really highlighted again in the lockdown when all the public toilets and all the shops closed. Suddenly people were chained to their homes. They could only go as far as they could, their bladder would allow them to, essentially. And it's something that's really not being spoken about because it's just not a sexy topic. But we think it's really important. So we wanted to open up the toilets in the basement of the pavilion for the public and everyone to be able to use. But first of all, we were hit with, they're a bit embarrassing, the state of the toilets. But eventually we got over that hurdle, and then it turned out that the toilets, they don't meet Italian building standards because of the way that they're hooked up to the cistern tank, and they're not fully accessible for disabled people. So we weren't able to open them up for people to physically use. So instead we've put them on display. And we've painted them with the toxic yellow, the toxic green that we spoke about earlier. And then we've put these photos of public toilets from around the UK on the insides. And so, yeah, so I think for us, this is almost the most important room because it's the one that's really allowing you to access all these different spaces that we've been talking about. So that concludes our tour of the Garden of Privatized Delights.
But what we also wanted to reflect on was kind of the journey it's taken to get here. So as Maddie said at the beginning, we're so excited to finally be in a room with real people and get to share this project, because all of the talks we've done, which have been many, have all been on Zoom primarily, and which has been great. And I guess when the Biennale was originally postponed in 2020, we didn't actually know if the exhibition would happen, and it's just been really exciting to finally see it, in Venice and to experience other people experiencing our ideas. But we used that extra year because our exhibition was kind of built and put in storage, so we really used it as a way to test these ideas, but also to look at the effects of coronavirus on these spaces. And if anything, it made the issue of privatized public space even more urgent than it was before, because so many of the spaces that were already under threat have been closed, like pubs up and down the country have closed. The high street, the problems have gotten much worse, but it's also made the public sector and the private sector realize that they have to work together, and in some cases work a lot faster to test things out, maybe fail, and then learn from that to make more robust and resilient solutions for the future. So while it's not been a journey without obstacles, I think Brexit also happened in the meantime, and we had to engage with that. It's been a really rewarding journey in other ways in terms of the conversations we've been able to have, and the ability to test some of these ideas out in the meantime. And it's also made us think about, who hasn't been able to travel to Venice. So from the very beginning, when we entered the competition, we knew that the Biennale was mainly visited by architects, and we also found out that the second largest audience is Italian school children. I actually saw quite a lot of school children visit the pavilion today. But we wanted to also think about how do we bring in new audiences that have never heard of the Biennale or have never thought about privatized public space. And so we were trying to think of ways to translate that both to online audiences, but also to people that can't travel to Venice. And so this is the British Council's website that has a whole host of resources from interviews with the different room designers who are kind of expand on the topics they've been looking at, and then also a virtual tour that was commissioned to kind of take you through the spaces if you haven't been able to come here. And there's a whole host of photography as well and other material you can engage with, which we hope will be the beginning of a kind of bigger legacy of like how this project can come back to the UK and be experienced by audiences in live privatized public spaces.
I suppose we think we're at quite an exciting sort of turning point, because it's really important to have the physical, and we've all been forced into this digital sphere. And there's something amazing when you go around the Giardini and you're in this physical world again. And going forward, how do we sort of have this hybrid world where we, physically create these things, but we also use the digital to our advantage to really communicate what's happening and allow everyone to be involved. And something for us that's been a real kind of silver lining of the Biennale being postponed was the Curators Collective. And this was initiated by Haiwan from the Korean Pavilion. And every few weeks, we'd all meet online. At first, it was just discussing what we were going through with the postponement. It was affecting everyone in different ways. And then through that, we slowly began to do collaborative projects together, such as the Bench in Venice project, which was initiated by the UAE Pavilion. And that was, you might have seen there are 3 benches dotted around the Giardini and the Arsenale, which have been built by students. So the UAE, they kind of came up with this list of all the unused elements in the different pavilions. And they then put out a brief for competition for any student from around the world to enter as to how they'd like to repurpose this material into a bench. And the 3 winning designs have been built, and they're on display outside the Japanese, Spanish, and UAE pavilions. And then also in the summer, the Austrian pavilion initiated this Midasage event, which was the first time we all met in person. And it was amazing because we'd gotten to know each other so well online. And I think we managed to have these discussions in person that wouldn't have happened otherwise, because through those conversations, we realized, for example, the Peruvian Pavilion is exploring a very similar topic to us. It's also all about how do you open up, how do you get rid of the railings and open up public space, and how do you create sort of play spaces for young people and teenagers. So the bottom image is this conversation we had with the Peruvian and Austrian pavilions. And so I think we're really interested in how we can hybridize all of this going forward. And then I suppose just finally, we're now at the kind of position of thinking about what next with the pavilion. We always imagined that each of these installations would be brought back to the UK and repurposed in different public spaces. And we had various conversations with different developers and cultural institutions before COVID, which were all very promising. And then obviously over the past year or two, a lot of people have lost funding. So we've had a real challenge to sort of find some spaces, but we're really excited that it looks like the structures will be going back to a community project in London, where they'll have a sort of second home and be used by the public in new and different ways. So that concludes our presentation about the Garden of Privatized Delights. The question we'd like to leave you with is, why can't all public spaces be gardens of delights? And we'd invite you to ask us any questions and join in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a good time.
I can start some questions. So I apologize for my very poor English in comparison of yours, of course. But I hope the public can organize some debate and some questions. But I can start with some curiosity. Of course, I appreciated very much the issues, the topics you proposed, and also the layout of this. Quite also ironical and a good play. But I was wondering of some things. One curiosity is about how your team experiments outside of this manifesto you proposed. We saw some samples about, but it would be interesting to know better as you work in your activity or practice with participation or with different activities. I think are connected with this manifesto. Yeah. The second question is a consideration. It's quite strange because many of these topics and issues you show seem to be inspired to a more Latin or Mediterranean or Southern way of life. And so I'm wondering what's the possible reaction and relationship with the English or the British way of life, which is also distinguished because I know Scottish, for example, is different than English and so on. It's a curiosity, but I think it's interesting in relation to this idea of asking to have a different use, for example, of the square or the gardens, the private gardens, and so on, which are very traditional in the English way of life. I've also a third question, linked to you in your conclusion you spoke of this pandemic and the delay of the Biennale and so on, and I was wondering what are the different declination we can find of these topics after the pandemic, because I'm sure it's strongly influenced the state, the perception, the uses of open and domestic space, but also of the public collective spaces. And it's a sort of double situation, because on one side this provoke a sense of solitude and isolation and so on, but on the other side this implies also a very strong desire of a new social meeting points, meeting places. And so I'm wondering what can change the new situation we are living in this debate. Thank you.
Great questions, thank you. I think we could be here for another hour. I have to say, your point about England being very different to Scotland and Wales and those kind of nuances is really interesting, because in Scotland there's a thing called the right to roam. So it means that anyone can there's like public rights of public way on private lands. So, you know, through like a large kind of field or something that's privately owned, you can still roam on it if you're a member of the general public, whereas we don't have that in England. So it's very much you are a trespasser. And that sort of filters down then into a lot of different ways that you can use different spaces, I think. And we were really interested in how, for example, in Edinburgh in Scotland, every year they have the Edinburgh Festival, where the whole city sort of becomes opened up and used by the public in lots of different ways, and you can access all of the city for free. And whereas London, sort of, when you tend to have these festivals, they tend to sort of then sort of be monetized and build up a sort of greater barrier between public and private. And so I think it's a really interesting question to touch upon the kind of nuances and differences within the same large country, how it breaks down in different regions. And I think that also filters down into the difference between public and private in villages, towns, and cities. So, for example, with the pub, pubs in cities are very different to the importance of a pub in a rural area. In a rural area, the pub, that's a really important communal centre, whereas in cities, the pub, it might really just be a place that people go and get drunk as teenagers, they're very different the way they're used. And I think those are nuances that, we think are really important to explore, and we'd love to sort of explore further, I think, within the work. And they're conversations we certainly had as a team. Everyone we invited to join the project was already pursuing some type of research that was related to this, which was why we invited them on board. And I think with the decorators who designed the pub room in particular, I think nearly everyone within their office wasn't British, so they were only familiar at first with London pubs. And then suddenly, as they explored pubs further, they suddenly realised about the Daisy pubs, which are sort of from the Indian community, and how there are all these kind of nuances as you sort of delve further into a topic. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that.
I think your point about how it feels more suited to Mediterranean communities is also really interesting, because actually what we wanted to do with the pavilion was also remind people that while the current trend is increasing privatization, and maybe British people aren't known for coming together and collectively working on public space, I think we wanted to remind people of things like the welfare state, which was really rooted in British culture, about like the social care that the state used to provide. But we also wanted to break with this nostalgia and waiting for the government to take on all of that responsibility, and to, as we said a few times in the presentation, to really bring different people from the public and private sector together to have the conversation, because their ambitions are the same, but they may be speaking different languages, or they have different parameters of what they want to achieve out of the project. But actually there's funding from the private sector, and there's a lot of initiatives from the public sector that could actually go hand in hand if they have the right conversation and engage the community. And we saw the project as a platform to start that conversation. But also, I think your question about our team and how they worked, I mean, we specifically selected people we knew who were already working in this area, but were doing really different things in terms of engaging the public. So we talked about public works and their situated image, but equally the decorators did this amazing project in Ridley Road Market in East London, where they actually asked people to bring different ingredients to make a meal. And so you didn't have to pay a ticket or pay to come to this dinner, but you had to bring an ingredient, and then collectively people made the dinner together. And it was a theatrical kind of stage set where the table lifted up off the ground, and then became this communal space for cooking and then enjoying things together. And each of the different practices have been doing really interesting work. But having been to lots of previous biennales, we didn't want to showcase case study projects. We actually wanted to think about, how do people experience architecture in the city? They usually experience it at one-to-one while walking around. And so we kind of asked everyone in our team to really translate their research and translate their case studies into designs for the 6 rooms of the pavilion. And it is quite a big pavilion, so we wanted to make sure we built these really big immersive spaces, which has sometimes been quite challenging. And
I think from the outset, in terms of a team, we had 2 rules. One was that they were already exploring this topic, and the second was no egos. We wanted people that we could work with collectively, and I think that really comes through on the project. It's a real team effort. There's no kind of domineering voice. There's no one room that kind of really sticks out. It's really about the collective experience. And because we're really interested in how, public and private, these spaces spaces, they work as a network in the city. And I suppose, for example, with the public toilet, we're really interested in how Sheffield, for example, has a scheme called Sheffield Labs, which means any private establishment can put a sticker in the window, and that means you're able to enter this establishment and just use the toilet for free. You don't need to buy anything. And so we're interested in those kind of networks and how it's about all these different spaces and things coming together. It's not about any one solution. And then I suppose in terms of coronavirus in the past year, you know, that's really heightened people's awareness. You know, we've really noticed that just the general public, in general, people are becoming much more aware of their surroundings, aware of how, you know, very small design moves can really transform the way that you're living and using a city. And I guess as well, the exhibition from the outset, we also said we don't want a traditional architecture exhibition that's just representing architecture. We don't just want loads of text and images on walls. We noticed that, you know, I think architects, we're very good at just writing and not knowing when to stop, which is why we limited everyone to having just that one question per room, which really like has to define what this room is exploring. And we wanted to make it very immersive, so that anyone can enter this pavilion and understand what it's about. We didn't want just a conversation of architecture for architects. For us, it's about having this conversation that everyone can be a part of and get involved.
And we didn't want the whole thing to be about coronavirus either, so we actually used the audio across the pavilion to reflect on maybe what's happened since. But we felt like these issues were still urgent even before coronavirus, and hopefully, like now, having realized that how important it is to have access to green space. I mean, for us, when in the first lockdown, when you could only have that 1 hour of exercise outside, public spaces, especially green spaces, were the only spaces you could come together safely, and that's where issues like access to the toilet became really important. Or, you know, there was the one moment if you lived alone that you could see other people, and that you could actually be safe. But then issues like the railings were creating pinch points where, you know, suddenly people were crowding as they tried to enter the spaces, and so it highlighted a lot of these issues that were already problematic, but in a very different way. And so it's given us a lot to reflect on, both us in our practice, but also in conversation with the wider community of architects and the public in terms of what can we do differently coming out of this to change who has access to public space.
And I think, sorry, just reflecting on this one more time, the way we worked with the team as well, we didn't want it to be just individual rooms working in isolation. We made a huge effort to sort of bring everyone together so everyone was aware of what the other rooms were exploring, how their designs are progressing. We all came to Venice together as a team to walk around the pavilion. It was really important to us there was this ongoing dialogue between everyone, and I think all the different room designers, although they obviously had a room that they were sort of in charge of, they did also inform the other rooms through different conversations. So it really was this kind of collaborative effort.
Some questions from the public? Sono sicuro che almeno Simone.
Just one question, maybe a little bit naive. Why Bosch? How? I'm just curious how it started. Why you choose this picture?
Yeah.
And yes, then I understand the rest of the inspiration, but why that?
I think when we had an initial brainstorm about what we might enter for the competition for the pavilion, and it came up pretty quickly that we wanted to, I've always really liked this painting, but I think for both of us, in terms of our sensibility of how we work on projects, we really like working through collage, and it was a really rich starting point. But then, especially working with such a big team, it was a good visual reference that we could keep returning to. And there's so much in that painting that you can talk about, think about, and be inspired by. But it also, the triptych format, like we talked about at the beginning of the talk, was really useful for us to talk about that binary of private and public and how to break it. But also, it's quite a well-known painting that Bosch didn't write a lot about what his thoughts were when he made the paintings. There's lots of religious interpretations of what he's talking about, but it allows different people to project their ideas onto it as a kind of blank canvas. And so it was maybe a bit controversial to start with a Dutch inspiration for a British pavilion, but it actually really helped us have conversations with the team, as Maddie was saying before, about how to stitch things together. But it also helped us come up with our concept. And I think this idea of delight doesn't get talked about enough in kind of architecture or in the design of cities and spaces. And the question that we ended the lecture on, really, how do we bring back a sense of delight in how we design public space and how people experience the city, was really important to us.
I think it's not a naive question, because a lot of people ask us this question, and I think we find it quite hard to answer, because the honest truth is it was quite instinctive. Like, we both loved the painting, and it was kind of a classic trusting your gut instinct, I think. We didn't really sort of overthink it. We both kind of quite quickly were like, this is an amazing reference, and sort of went forward from there. And yeah, I think it's an incredible painting, and it's brought so much richness to the project. But I don't think it took us very long to choose it. It just kind of was there, and it was the perfect kind of reference.
And also the idea of the garden, the gardens feel very accessible and they feel like they're always a good thing, but actually green space is something that isn't necessarily always good. Like, it can sometimes be really difficult to maintain if depending on where you are, and you have to really think about, like, who are you providing that for? And it's also where we wanted to question, like, does a public space always need to be an outdoor green space, or can it be a networked space like the high street, or a social space like the pub? And so we've interpreted the word garden in different ways across the pavilion. And so, yeah, even the title of the painting gave us a lot of material to work with.
It's been really useful to have, because it's such a serious topic, and it can be really dry when it's discussed. And I think it allowed this level of abstraction and this level of humor almost to bring into the conversation, which then intends to engage a much wider audience and allows you to have those much richer conversations. And so I think that for us was really important, that we didn't just discuss this topic in a really dry, purely academic way. It needed this different levels of richness, and it's been an incredible tool to help us get different people around the table and to allow people to engage with the fact, it's not a binary conversation. Just so often people already set up for this binary good versus bad, and it really helps to set up that conversation for us.
Yes, I have only some notes about your presentation, but also when I visited the pavilion, I was a little bit, in the middle between it is like you try to individuate many informal practices, in UK, I think, but also some informal practice, but that dwells in a very symbolic space, like the pub, the English pub, because as you said before, the English pub is something also very different in a rural context and in the city. In the rural context, it is the main. It represents sort of center, a civic center, where people meet and they drink and things like that, to explain. So all these different situations remind me that, for example, I live in very difficult cities in Italy, which is Naples. And in Naples, it's the opposite of UK. You cannot design as an architect the gardens, the public gardens, because then you have this problem of how to maintain it, Because when you arrive in England, in some way you find a lot of very beautiful parks, and instead in Naples this is a very huge problem. And now in Naples we are thinking on adopting the public space from the private, So we are asking to, all the administration, the syndic, the major, ask people to private family or private companies to adopt gardens, to maintain, to use the vegetation, because they are against this sort of informal, which is a huge practice in Naples. I mean, they leave people with a lot of problems. They live there. Come si dice, homeless. So there is a life, but it's like the public gardens or the public spaces are occupied by these homeless. And to go against this practice, they asked people to have this kind of privatization, to adopt the practice. So I do not understand if this idea of do you have is something that is that if we can do a sort of comparison, a parallel between this idea of adopting the public spaces, but I mean, it's like you have a very optimistic, no, idea of how to combine this idea of private and public in the gardens, which in a way is adopted in other countries or in other parts. So this is only something that I don't know if it's comparable. And then the last thing instead is that it looks like you combine informal and pop culture in a way. Is it true, or it's something in which you are not interested?
I think I think your points are really valid, because one of the big challenges we had when designing the exhibition is we didn't want to just, because we were building these immersive spaces, we didn't want to just recreate like a stage set for the city that of what's already there. But we had to show enough of what these spaces were like in the UK, because it's an international exhibition, so people understood them if they'd never been there. But then also show what we were proposing to do differently. And in general, the conversation around privatized public space is quite a negative one. Like, everyone thinks it's a bad thing, and they haven't really explored like how connected it is to British culture and history. And so what we really wanted to do is try and show a bit of both, like what's existing and what could happen, but also learn from how people use the space in different ways. So that's why we ask the questions in each of the rooms, because we really want to, for us, like this, the 6 months of the Biennale are a way to actually test out, like, do these spaces work? Like, what are ways that people could use them that we never even imagined? But also, how do we combine some of the formal qualities of a public space with some of the informal activities that we want to encourage to happen there? Because what will really make these spaces richer is if lots of different things can happen in them over time. And we went through many iterations of the design in order to figure out like how to communicate these things to different audiences and how to encourage people to act and use these spaces in different ways. But it has been a challenge, and I think it's very hard to have this one-size-fits-all approach to solve huge issues. Like, homelessness is a big issue even in the UK, and it's probably impossible for an architect to solve that, but that's where we think that people working together from across different sectors and all these different stakeholders, bringing them together, that gives us a better chance of addressing huge issues like homelessness or climate change or, maintenance of public space. Like, privatized public spaces are very maintained, but then in return for that maintenance, you give up some of the rights you have to like maybe do whatever you want in those spaces. So what are ways we can talk about having more diverse forms of exchange in terms of what's allowed in those spaces and what should be happening there?
Yeah, it's the awareness and giving the public the tools to be able to reclaim their public spaces. So as a member of the public in the UK and here, like, you have huge say actually in what's going on around you, but often it's very opaque. Like, you don't actually know how you can become involved in those processes. So our catalogue, for example, we sort of saw that as a kind of manual for people to take and understand how they can start to reclaim their public spaces. And I suppose it's about improving that awareness. So the homelessness is a really important topic, because in the UK you have this thing called hostile design, which is where you get these spikes where homeless people can't then sleep on a bit of land, or on the bench, people will add like an extra kind of handle so that someone can't lie down on the bench, and it's not fixing any problem, it's just sort of ushering the problem onto somewhere else. And there's a really interesting artist called Stuart Semple, who came up with this stickers called and a hashtag on Twitter called Design Crime, and he started sticking these stickers in his hometown of Bournemouth on the armrests of these benches, and through this it kind of educated the local community into what was going on, because a lot of people didn't even realize this was happening, because why would you unless you're homeless? And suddenly there's like a lot of community kind of angst about this, and eventually the council had to remove those armrests so that now the benches, homeless people can sleep on them. It's also not fixing the problem, but you know, a lot of it is about how do you actually raise awareness of these issues? How do you get people to understand that they actually have a say in what's going on around them, and the power of the collective and the community and people coming together. Often I think architects can be very idealistic and we want to change the world, but if we're only having that conversation with ourselves, we're not really going to change anything. It's about bringing everyone together and using all our different skills, you know, together with that aligned goal and vision, and then we can really start to transform and change things.
But it's also why we really, I mean, your question about pop culture was really great, because I think we really do like pop culture, and that you see it appear in different moments in the pavilion, from the karaoke to, you know, like the situated image. It uses a lot of references drawn from pop culture. And it's because it's something that everyone can relate to. And so we're really trying to expand this conversation outside of just architects talking to architects, and really trying to think of how can we engage the public. And one of the quotes that really inspired this project was by Jane Jacobs, who was saying, I'm going to paraphrase this because I can't remember it exactly, but about how cities can have something for everybody only when and only because they're designed by everybody. So we really need to bring everyone along with us, and pop culture is a really useful tool to do that, to get people to care and engage with these topics, and, you know, realize that they can have a say in what happens to their public spaces.
I think the language is very important for us, because often architects can talk in this kind of jargon, and no one really knows what we're trying to say. And I think for us, like, you know, we really tested out all those questions on non-architects, and, you know, people who would then be like, but what does that mean? And we'd be like, well, yeah, if you don't immediately know what that means, then that means it's the wrong question. You know, we need to make sure that everyone can understand this in order to then take a part and be a part of this journey.
Say that you are more interested in the dwelling perspective than in the building perspective. Is it true, or?
What do you mean by dwelling perspective?
I mean, that you are more interested in how people can live the space, and so.
Right. Yeah. No. I
Start to design, so it's like sort of trying to.
I think it's both. Like, I think we're really interested in how the architect can take on these different roles, and architects are designers, and, you know, through small design moves, you know, for example, getting rid of the railings, that can open up a piece of space. But the kind of, it's very like easy, you know, simpler, or like physically to remove some railings, but politically it's a very loaded move. And, you know, to build a building in a city, that's politically like quite a big thing to do, but for some reason architects often shy away from the politics of it all. But yeah, I think for us, perhaps we are more interested in sort of making the most out of what is already existing. How do we create, you know, make sure those everyday spaces are starting to really bring joy to people? It's not about having like a new skyscraper or something. How do we work with the existing city and these existing spaces to start to open them up?
Thank you.
Sì. Acceso.
Thank you. It's a double question regarding the first set of rules that London gave for the private-owned public spaces. The first one, when it was publicated, did society participated in the process of like establishing these rules, and how was the reaction of the public? There was some visible improvements since the publication of it and the first time till now. And then this, I imagine, right when you showed us the rules, and then after you showed all of the presentation, and especially when you reminded that the Biennale was postponed a little bit, it was very recent that you explained that the rules were established. Did the publication affected in some way the way that you worked, how you reacted and proposed the pavilion?
Great question. Yeah. So the draft of the rules were published last year, just before the first lockdown, and the GLA have been working on them for a really long time because it's a very, like you say, it's like a very politically kind of loaded thing to do, and no one else has done this before. So it's quite brave suddenly to do this, and so that was the draft publication we showed, and so the actual final, I think, publication they just were released like maybe 2 or 3 months ago. So it's very, very new, and I think probably too early to really see how it will affect. But I think what's important is it's already making landowners more aware. It's easier to have a conversation about something as a designer if it's in legislation. So if it says in legislation that you have to open something up for free, it's much easier to do that than if you're saying, oh, it'd be amazing if we opened this up for free, and then someone's coming in commercially and saying, no, we can't. And so it's kind of easier if it comes from that perspective. And I think definitely, like Manijeh was saying, being involved in those conversations with the GLA around that public space charter, like it definitely started to really inform different parts of our kind of pavilion. And I think likewise it was sort of like a two-way dialogue. So yeah, I think it was really kind of helped to enrich the kind of arguments behind the different spaces.
And I think rather than rules, they're called like principles or guidelines. And I think it's going to probably have an impact in the long term as new public spaces start to be designed. But even the name of it as the Public London Charter is really interesting because it's the same set of guidelines or principles that will govern all public space, whether they're truly public and like kind of owned by the government and managed that way, or whether they're privatized. And so it creates a kind of equal playing field because there's lots of signage in public space that tells you what you can't do and limits what you can do in the space. So it's not just in privatized public space that's an issue, but also that it took quite a long time for them to produce that first draft that was launched. I think it was in March, so right before we went into lockdown. And they engaged a lot of different people in the shaping of those. So they actually commissioned the Center for Architects to have discussions with different community groups, to talk to different stakeholders for public space. And so it was kind of a crowdsourced project. And they've been trying to collect case studies along the way. And then the conversations that we've been part of have been about, like, how do we think of our street spaces differently? How do we redesign high streets? They brought in different community groups and are offering grants to community groups to change their high streets, especially coming out of COVID. Like, what are ways to re-engage that, and how do we learn from each other? So there's like so many high streets across the UK, and some of them are doing really incredible things, like markets for teenagers, where teenagers can go and like become entrepreneurs and sell things that they've made. And one guy came and presented that, and then all the other high streets wanted to like learn from him and like ask, and they were asking how they can set up something similar. And so I think what it's really created is a space for discussion and as a way to bring people together, and hopefully that impact is going to be felt for years to come.
I'd be really interested. Is there anything similar in Italy? Or... Oh, sorry.
Where are you from?
I'm Brazilian.
Oh, great.
Oh.
So maybe there's lots of interesting examples in Brazil of how public spaces are used.
Well, that took me by surprise. I think that like many initiatives want to be taken by different society groups. In my city, there are some traditional fairs, farms market, and on the street, but I think that politics on discussing this, especially discussing this with the open society, they are still very much in the beginning, and the big corporations' interests, they go very much into that because they have the same space to talk where the open society they have and the civil groups have to discuss this. So this awareness is the first step. And for us, it would be still the first step that we would need to take. That is not possible yet right now to have this discussion in a same level as you proposed, as you would like for this pavilion to be this first step of awareness. I think for us we would need something like that. In fact, I would have to reflect a little more on the question, but yeah.
Thank you.
We're sorry we put you on the spot, but it was
No,
just
no.
because we think it's really interesting about how privatized public space exists across all cities and spaces, but it kind of changes, and those nuances that Maddie was talking about change depending on which country or which city you are, and like how, at what stage in the conversation those spaces are being discussed. And I mean, in the UK at least, there's lots of bills. Like recently, there was a policing bill that was being discussed that's really going to change our ability to protest in public space, and that's part of like a human right of what you should be able to do in public space, and it's going to fundamentally change how we behave in cities. And there were a lot of protests around preventing that bill, and so I don't know, it's like an interesting time to be talking about this.
Yes, actually, when you said something about that, showed the example of that square, it surprised me a lot that a public space could be. I think that was the first moment that I really understood the consequences of these private-owned public spaces. I know that in my city there are some private-public partnerships to maintain the public spaces, as the professor suggested. But this comes almost like a advertisement for these very own corporations. They do their advertisements during Christmas and something like that, at the same time that they take care of that square or that park. I wouldn't know how deep they can really influentiate. I don't think that they can influentiate how the space will be used.
Thank you.
Other question?
If there are no more questions.
You can also come and ask us questions.
No, there is one more. Come.
Okay. I would like to ask, what about heritage? Because it's common to see in Europe, I think, a lot of private spaces transformed in public spaces because of their historical value, for example. And for you, is this part of maybe a big strategies? I think about English gardens. Some of them are maybe really old. And I would like to ask if there are some communities that feel that these private spaces as part of their public heritage, or it is just a private heritage, and if this historical value is it can be part of a strategy of transforming these private spaces in public spaces. What is your idea about that?
It's a really good observation, because heritage is really important, and actually that's one of the reasons why we selected spaces like the Garden Square and the pub, because they're so rooted in British history. Like the Garden Square's been around since the Georgian era, and it was really a way to ensure that as cities became more dense and people were living in houses side by side, that they still had access to green space when they no longer had individual private gardens. They had a shared garden. But then as the cities evolved, that type of space hasn't evolved, but how can we kind of remember that shared feeling and use that, as you say, as a strategy for developing that as we move forward into the future? And I think this idea of public heritage, or like a shared heritage, is really important to really make us all be involved in like how we preserve an understanding of cities and how they've evolved over time, but also allow them to evolve, because sometimes they get too stuck in a certain period. Like the railings were removed, as Mandy was saying, like during the Second World War, but they were reinstated because of a visual kind of
They were
appearance.
reinstated by English heritage.
Yeah.
So, so I think like our painting, it's not black and white. Like it's not good and bad. It's like heritage has to be part of that conversation. But I suppose the danger is when it's the only part of the conversation.
Or when they privilege the visual, like they reinstated those railings because they wanted to reinstate the kind of visual qualities of the Georgian Square, but actually what they forgot was like the importance of that shared space or the collective space. And so it's about maybe understanding heritage through a more nuanced perspective as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great point to add, though. Like, it's definitely a part of a conversation that has to be there, because otherwise we start destroying bits of our city that already work, and we need to learn from the past. You know, we need to learn what isn't working. But as Manijeh says, it's like understanding the nuances behind what's working, and it's not always a physical. Like, heritage doesn't have to just be physical, I think. So yeah, it's really interesting.
And also understanding like what should be protected. So the communities that come together to buy their local pub, like a lot of pubs are just being torn down to build like or converted into residential buildings for rich people to live in. And actually, they're quite important social spaces as we discussed, but also some of the architecture of those buildings is incredible. Like especially Weatherspoons, like they tend to take over like these really beautiful buildings in whichever place that they exist and turn them into pubs. But like, what if communities could do the same thing? And they can, but it's just making people more aware of that and seeing that as an act of preservation or of preserving heritage in a very different way and a kind of more socially driven way.
It's always quite interesting, I think, to see what's listed about a building. I'm sure it's similar in Italy and in the UK, like buildings are listed depending on sort of a heritage status. So something might be grade 2-star listed, and then it will be written into that listing exactly what it is that has to be kept. So it could be something physical like the windows or a door or something. But I worked on a project called Battersea Arts Centre, and it was grade 2-star listed, and the listing was the use of the building. So the use has to stay as a communal building. And the building, it sort of had a really bad fire, so we were reinstating the building, and externally we had to reinstate it as it looks before, like Victorian era. But inside we had a lot more freedom, so we could keep the fire staining. We could really upgrade the space so it actually works better for the community. So I think it's really interesting to kind of delve into what it is about the heritage that needs to be kept and what it is that perhaps can be transformed and moved on. I think it's a really great question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
We're also happy to stick around if anyone feels shy to ask a question in the big room and wants
always
to
email
ask
us.
something.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we do not have more questions, we thank you very much, and we will see next time on the 13th of November with Carla Wasaba. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.